A community in rural Colombia spent 3 centuries telling outsiders exactly which African people their ancestors came from, a specific ethnic group, a specific region, passed down as fact, through oral tradition, while academics filed it away as folklore too precise to take seriously. Modern genetics just tested that claim against nearly 3,000 African samples spanning 42 distinct ethnic groups. The village was right, not approximately right, not broadly right. Right down to the specific people their ancestors actually were. San Basilio de Palenque sits about 70 kilometers southeast of Cartagena, founded in the early 1600s by Africans who escaped Spanish slave ships and slaving operations along Colombia's Caribbean coast, fortifying a settlement in the hills that Spanish colonial forces repeatedly failed to retake. Colonial records document the attacks and the failures directly, an inconvenient military embarrassment for an empire that considered itself unstoppable. Palenque wasn't the only fortified maroon settlement of its kind founded in the region during this period. It was, however, the only one that survived. In 1691, facing the reality that military conquest wasn't working, the Spanish crown issued a formal decree recognizing Palenque's freedom, making it the first officially free African-descended settlement anywhere in the Americas, more than a full century before Haiti became the first free black republic in the hemisphere. The community that built and defended that freedom didn't simply preserve a general sense of African heritage, the way many diaspora populations across the Americas eventually had to settle for after generations of forced separation from specific ancestral knowledge. Palenque's residents developed and maintained something far more specific, Palenquero, the only Bantu Spanish Creole language documented anywhere in the world, still spoken as a living daily language in the community today. Linguists studying Palenquero identified roughly 200 words in regular contemporary use, tracing directly back to a Kikongo language, and further linguistic analysis narrowed the likely source even further, pointing specifically to Yombe, a Kikongo dialect historically spoken in the Congo region of Central Africa. This wasn't a vague claim about broadly West or Central African roots. This was a community naming a specific people, generation after generation, embedded directly into the grammar and vocabulary of their own everyday speech. Given a claim this specific, surviving for over 3 centuries through language rather than documentation, you'd reasonably expect modern genetics, if it ever got around to testing it directly, to find the claim had drifted or blurred over time, the way oral traditions about specific ancestral origins usually do when tested rigorously against hard genetic evidence rather than being taken at face value. Before we get to what the genetic testing actually found, it's worth sitting with how unusual it would be for a 300-year-old oral claim filtered through language rather than written record, naming one specific ethnic group among dozens of plausible candidates across the entire West and Central African coast, to hold up with any real precision at all. Most populations this channel has profiled carry general regional ancestry claims that genetics can broadly confirm. Very few carry a claim this narrow and specific. In 2016, researchers publishing in Proceedings of the Royal Society B analyzed Y-chromosome and mitochondrial DNA from present-day Palenque residents and compared the results directly against genetic data from 42 different African ethnic groups, a reference dataset covering 2,799 individuals across the broader region the transatlantic slave trade drew from. The Y-chromosome results, tracing paternal ancestry specifically, were unambiguous. The genetic data matched Yombe more closely than any of the other 41 comparison groups, confirming, through an entirely independent line of evidence, the same specific ethnic origin the linguistic analysis of Palenquero had already pointed to. Oral tradition, said Yombe. Language structure, said Yombe. Now the Y-chromosome data said Yombe too. Here's a question worth sitting with, because it's the one that actually matters here. How does a specific ethnic identity like this survive with this much precision for over 300 years? Through slavery, isolation, and total cultural rupture from the African continent, when so many other diaspora populations lost this level of specificity within a generation or two. Part of the answer sits in the founder effect pattern the same genetic study identified. A population descended from a relatively small, concentrated founding group, whose genetic signal never got heavily diluted by later, more diverse waves of arrival, the way populations in larger, more continuously active slave trading ports often were. The study's mitochondrial DNA results reinforced this from the maternal side too, finding substantial sub-Saharan African ancestry and a strong founder effect, though the maternal lineages themselves trace to a broader mix of African source populations rather than pointing to one specific group the way the paternal line did, suggesting the founding men may have come from a more concentrated single origin than the founding women. If a 300-year-old oral claim getting confirmed down to a specific ethnic group by genetic testing against nearly 3,000 comparison samples is the kind of precision that impresses you, that's exactly why it's worth subscribing now, because this channel keeps finding populations whose own internal knowledge turns out to be more accurate than the academic record gave them credit for. And if your own family has passed down a specific claim about exactly where your ancestors came from, something more precise than a general regional guess, tell us in the comments, because Palenque's case suggests those specific claims deserve to be taken far more seriously than they usually are. It's worth naming the person most closely associated with Palenque's founding resistance, because Colombian oral and written history preserves him with unusual specificity for a Maroon leader from this early period. Benkos Bioho, an enslaved man believed to have originated from the Bran region of what is now Guinea-Bissau, is credited as the principal organizer of the escape and fortification effort that established Palenque in the early 1600s, leading repeated successful resistance against Spanish forces sent to retake the settlement before his eventual capture and execution by Spanish authorities in 1621. Bioho's leadership predates the 1691 Freedom Decree by 7 decades, meaning the community he helped found had already been successfully defending its independence for 2 full generations before Spain finally accepted the arrangement as permanent rather than temporary. Modern Palenque continues to honor Bioho specifically, with a central plaza and ongoing cultural commemorations named directly for him, a founding figure whose specific identity survived in community memory with the same precision as the Yombe ancestral claim itself. It's worth explaining what made Palenquero itself such a linguistic anomaly worth studying this closely in the first place, because a Bantu Spanish Creole isn't simply a dialect with some borrowed vocabulary layered on top. Linguists classify Palenquero as a genuine Creole language with its own distinct grammatical structure, one that combines Spanish-derived vocabulary with syntactic patterns, verb structures, and phonological features tracing directly to Kikongo language family influence, making it structurally unlike Spanish in ways that go well beyond word borrowing. For decades, linguists debated exactly which Central African language family had shaped that underlying grammar most directly, a question that mattered because different candidate languages would have pointed toward different specific regions and different possible slave trade routes into Cartagena. The detailed comparison work narrowing that answer specifically to Yombe, a dialect of Kikongo spoken in a fairly contained region of the Congo, gave geneticists an unusually precise linguistic target to test against, rather than the broad, multi-region guesswork most historical linguistic reconstructions of Creole origins have to work with. That precision is part of what makes the 2016 genetic confirmation so much more significant than it might first appear. Testing a population's DNA against 42 different African reference groups and finding a clean match to the exact same specific dialect community the linguists had already independently identified isn't a coincidence. Easily explained away. It would be relatively unremarkable for genetics to confirm a broad claim like general Central African ancestry, since Central African ancestry is common across huge portions of the African diaspora throughout the Americas. confirming one specific dialect-level ethnic community out of dozens of plausible candidates, using two totally separate methodologies developed decades apart by entirely different research disciplines, is a far higher bar to clear, and Palenque cleared it. There's one more genetic detail worth adding, because it reinforces just how isolated this population remained across 3 centuries. The same research found no significant indigenous American or European genetic contribution to Palenque's population, a striking finding for a community that has existed inside Colombia, surrounded by a much more broadly mixed national population for over 300 years. Where most African-descended populations across Latin America show measurable European and often indigenous admixture accumulated over centuries of proximity and contact, Palenque's genetic isolation matches its cultural and linguistic isolation almost exactly, 3 different lines of evidence: genetic, linguistic, and historical, all pointing toward the same conclusion from 3 completely independent directions. For Palenque's residents today, this scientific confirmation arrives as a footnote to an identity the community never treated as uncertain in the first place. Palenquero remains a living daily language, taught formally in local schools and recognized by UNESCO as a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. Traditional healing practices, funeral rites, and musical traditions tracing specifically to Kikongo Bantu cultural structures continue as lived practice rather than historical reenactment. The community that Spain was forced to officially recognize as free in 1691 spent the centuries since not waiting for outside validation of who they were, but simply continuing to be exactly that, precisely enough, that when the genetic testing finally arrived, it had nothing meaningfully new to tell them about their own history. What Palenque proves, with a level of specificity almost no other population in this series has matched, is that oral tradition, properly maintained and transmitted with enough precision over enough generations, can outperform academic skepticism by centuries. The village named its ancestors correctly the entire time. Genetics just finally caught up enough to check. 300 years of careful transmission, through language rather than paper, turned out to be more reliable than 3 centuries of outside academic doubt.